This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom, where you can pre-order every card from Phyrexia All Will Be One right now using my referral link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Phyrexia All Will Be One limited set review. So far I've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards in the set, and today we're continuing with a look at all the blue cards. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you aren't sure what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you can find an explanation. Before we take a look at our first blue card, a few reminders. This review is about limited. That means draft and sealed. This means that I'm only going to be reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also, keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing the new format, and that means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions. After all, every format is different, and as I play this format, I'll be providing updates about it here on the channel. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll get a spreadsheet with all my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our first blue card, which is Aspirants Ascent, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant, and it says until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+3 and gains flying and Toxic 1. This is the first time we're seeing Toxic in this video, so I'll remind you what it does. Players dealt combat damage by a creature who has Toxic get a poison counter equal to the toxic value, in this case 1, and if you get to 10 poison, you lose. 1-mana tricks have been some pretty serious business of late, and I think this looks like another solid one. This kind of gives you two separate uses, which is great for a card with a low cost. First, it can be used as a traditional trick to help your creature win combat with the +1/+3 boost, but you can also use it before your opponent blocks to make a big creature take to the air and crack in for a bunch of damage, along with some toxic upside. I have a hard time ever going beyond a C on tricks because they do come with significant downsides. It takes a really exceptional one to get there, and I don't quite think this is better than a C. I think it is another C-level trick though, which is pretty good for a trick. Next up, it's Atmosphere Surgeon, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Phyrexian wizard at uncommon. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it, and you can remove an oil counter from it, and target creature gains flying until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. This looks pretty good. It's basically a convoluted version of a creature that can give flying to other creatures when you cast a non-creature spell. It can even give flying to itself, and that's pretty nice. And one nice thing about it doing the oil counter thing is if you don't have creatures at the time you cast that non-creature spell to give flying, you can hold on to it. It also means this works better with Proliferate, a mechanic in the set that allows you to make more counters. So overall, I think this is worth taking fairly highly. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Blade of Shared Souls, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare artifact equipment with 4 Mirrodin. This mechanic means that when it enters the battlefield, you get a 2/2 red rebel creature token and attach this equipment to it. And when Blade of Shared Souls becomes attached to a creature, for as long as Blade of Shared Souls remains attached to it, you may have that creature become a copy of another target creature you control, and it has equipped too. So, when you first play this, you're getting a 3-mana 2/2 with Clone upside. That's pretty nice, as 3 mana will often net you something worth a lot more. I do like that you can play it on an empty board if you have to as well, unlike some clones, but it also then has the upside of sticking around and potentially letting you move it to other creatures to make copies of other things. You won't always be able to generate a ton of value with it, but there will be times where this duplicates an amazing creature, and the floor on the card is fine too. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it is Blue Sun's Twilight, which is X and 2 blue mana for a rare sorcery. It says gain control of target creature with mana value X or less. If X is 5 or more, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Mind Control is one of the most powerful things you can do in Limited, as taking an opposing creature and gaining it on your side of the board is, effectively, a 2-for-1. This comes with the additional absurd upside of making a token if you pay 5 or more for X. 7 mana to steal an opposing permanent and make a copy of it is insane, and an easy 3-for-1. The one downside here is that this is a little bit awkward early, but even stealing like a 2-drop with this on turn 4 is really good, and that can be a play that flips a game wildly in your favor. It is going to be hard to ever steal like a completely massive creature with this, but, stealing your opponent's 5-drop and making a copy of it is probably just better than stealing a bigger creature anyway. This is an amazing bomb. I'm giving it an A+. Next, it's Bring the Ending, which costs 1 generic and a blue for a common instant. It says counter target spell unless its controller pays 2 generic mana. And it has Corrupted. This is a mechanic that means a card gets an upgrade if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. In this case, it just counters the spell entirely without your opponent getting a chance to pay for mana if you have Corrupted. So this starts out as a bad mana leak, and by the later stages of the game becomes a really efficient hard counter. I actually like this design because this type of counterspell is usually only good early in the game and pretty bad late because your opponent's more likely to just be able to pay the mana and you use the card for basically nothing. So adding Corrupted to the mix means that this will actually be pretty good all game long. Especially because I think Corrupted is reasonably accessible in blue. Basically, this will be good early like all counterspells like it, but there will also be a significant chunk of the game where it's still good because you have Corrupted. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Chrome Prowler, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 Phyrexian cat, a common. It's an artifact creature. It's got flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you tap target creature an opponent controls. So, none of what this does is especially big. It has mediocre stats and an enter the battlefield ability that is often underwhelming. A 3/2 with flash can ambush block stuff, but not that effectively. It just ends up being a surprise trade or chump block. The tap effect can be nice at the right situation, but overall, I don't think this is going to have enough of an impact on games to make the cut consistently. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Distorted Curiosity, which is 2 generic and a blue for an uncommon sorcery. It costs 2 less if you have Corrupted, and you can draw 2 cards. So, Divination is a C- level card a lot of the time, and that's what the base of this card is. Not adding to the board can be rough, but getting a 2-for-1 for 3 mana is pretty nice, and this has the potential to only cost a single mana in the later stages of the game, which is pretty amazing. Early, you can use this to help you hit your land drop or whatever, as you often use Divination for, and then in the mid to late game, you can cast this for 1 and probably play at least one of the things you drew. At that point, it will feel like it is impacting the board. I'm not sure how many of these you really want. It will depend on just how easy it is to get Corrupted going, but I definitely think it will be easy enough that you'll want the first copy of this in a lot of blue decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Encroaching Mycosynth, which for 3 generic and a blue is a rare artifact. Non-land permanents you control are artifacts in addition to their other types. The same is true for permanent spells you control and non-land permanent cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. So, this is basically a Mycosynth lattice that doesn't hit lands and only affects you, and that's awful and limited. Sure, I get it, there's artifact payoffs in the set, but the impact this has on the board will be pretty meaningless about 99% of the time, and the times where it gives you an actual card worth of value will be even rarer. This is definitely a card that was printed with other formats in mind. It's an F in limited. Next, it's Escaped Experiment, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 artifact creature Phyrexian beast at common. When it attacks, target creature an opponent controls gets -X/-0 until end of turn, where X is the number of artifacts you control. On its own, this is a 2-mana 2/1 that gives -1/-0 to an opposing creature when it attacks, and its ability can lower power more than that in a lot of situations. This can enable some nice attacks, not just for the experiment, but the rest of your board. That said, it doesn't really change the ability of your opponent's creatures to block effectively. They may not be able to kill things they tussle with, but if they could already block your stuff and survive, that's still going to be true. This will definitely open up the board in some situations, but there'll be others where it just doesn't do enough. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Experimental Augury, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order, and it has Proliferate, which allows you to choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. Anticipate usually isn't great in limited, but tacking Proliferate onto it does matter. There are lots of counters in this set, and even payoffs for proliferating in particular. On top of that, blue-red like spells, and this kind of instant that replaces itself always gets a boost from that kind of deck. Basically, this will affect the board somewhat often, thanks to adding oil counters to things and stuff like that, while also giving you the usual card selection and Anticipate gives you. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Eye of Malcator, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 2, and whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, it becomes a 4/4 Phyrexian Eye artifact creature until end of turn. One of Blue's big themes is artifacts, and this is certainly a payoff for playing them. It's nice that it scries up front, which means you can make sure you're more likely to hit artifacts on your next couple of turns. Still, most of these cards we see that aren't always creatures but can temporarily become creatures when X happens have been sort of underwhelming. It's just rough that the card is near irrelevant on your opponent's turn and often doesn't do enough on your turn either. I think it's just a C. Not really a payoff you're really desperate for. Next up, it's Font of Progress, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon artifact. It enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. You pay 3 and tap it, and target player mills X cards, where X is the number of oil counters on Font of Progress. Mill strategies rarely work out in Limited, mostly because actually affecting the board is very important, and mill has almost no effect on the game until your opponent actually runs out of cards. There is a card we'll see later in this video that I think can help you win with mill, but I don't think this is it. You don't really want to spend your mana on this ability. You want to be playing things that are meaningful. Even proliferating to get this where it mills more cards isn't going to be good enough. I'm giving this an F. Next up, it's Gitaxian Anatomist, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/5 Phyrexian wizard at common, and when it enters the battlefield you can tap it, and if you do, you proliferate. A 4 mana 2/5 is passable, and having the option to proliferate can be nice, especially because blue has lots of oil counters running around, and some poison too. It's definitely awkward you have to tap this to proliferate, since the thing this card is best at in terms of combat is blocking, and not being able to do that for a turn might be a liability. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Gitaxian Raptor, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 Phyrexian bird at common. It's got flying, and it enters the battlefield with 3 oil counters on it. You can remove an oil counter from it to give it +1/-1 until end of turn. A 3 mana 1/4 flyer is an acceptable rate, so it's nice that this has the upside of using oil counters to increase its power and lower its toughness. 3 oil counters is a nice number to have, as just attacking with this and turning it into a 2/3, 3 turns in a row, is going to feel pretty good. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Glistener Seer, which for 1 blue mana is a 0/3 Phyrexian Advisor at common. Enters the battlefield with 3 oil counters on it, and you can tap it and remove an oil counter to scry 1. 1 mana 0/3s tend to be pretty underwhelming, but this one scries, and that can be pretty awesome, especially in the earlier stages of the game, where you can smooth out your draws. It's pretty good late too, because it helps you avoid flooding and things like that. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Kher Synthesizer, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 Phyrexian wizard at common, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it, and as long as it has 4 or more oil counters, it gets +2/+0 and can't be blocked. A 2 mana 1/3 is below rate these days, but this does eventually become an unblockable 3/3, and that's certainly something your opponent has to contend with. What I don't like is that if you don't get this down earlier in the game, your chances of getting those oil counters are significantly curtailed, in which case you're just playing something that is just a 2 mana 1/3, and I really don't like that. It might be nice on turn 2 or 3, but after that, I think this card is going to be pretty difficult to get a good use out of. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Ickermoon Gauntlet, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare, mythic rare artifact. Planeswalkers you control have 0 loyalty, proliferate, and -12 loyalty. Take an extra turn after this one. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose a counter on target permanent. Put an additional counter of that kind on that permanent. The Planeswalker part of this card basically doesn't matter. I mean, there are more Planeswalkers than normal in this set, but you're still very unlikely to ever have more than 1 in your deck, and if you just have 1 in your deck, obviously that's not enough of a reason to run this card for that first ability. But it does do stuff with things that aren't Planeswalkers. You know, anytime you cast a non-creature spell, you can add a counter to something. But overall, I think this still doesn't really do enough. It's basically a bad version of Proliferate is what you get from its second ability. And you're not really going to be desperate for bad Proliferate in blue, where there are several cards that will allow you to proliferate much more easily. It also doesn't work with poison counters. I mean, it really is just a bad version of Proliferate in every way. I think this is just an F. You know, it doesn't add to the board in any way, really. And the fact that it makes you jump through hoops just to add 1 counter at a time to something just isn't worth it. Next, it's Jace the Perfected Mind, who costs 2 generic, a blue, and a blue/Phyrexian mana. Starts with 5 loyalty, he's a mythic rare, and he has Completed, which means if you pay 2 life instead of blue mana for the Phyrexian mana symbol, he enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters. He's got a +1 that says until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3/-0. He's got a -2 that says target player mills 3 cards. Then, if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards, otherwise you draw a card. And his -X says target player mills 3 times X cards. So, This is the card I referred to earlier that I think can actually win you the game with Mill. This doesn't quite feel like a bomb to me, but Jace does look like a pretty real win condition, especially in more controlling decks. His +1 makes it hard to take him down. His -2 will let you either load your own graveyard or try to mill out your opponent while drawing you a card. Sometimes you'll get to draw extra. I think most of the time you'll actually choose the latter, especially because it synergizes better with his -X, which feels like the biggest threat this card has. If you pay the full 4 mana for Jace, he can come down and immediately mill 15 cards, which can get pretty close to just milling your opponent out, especially by the late game. If you play him early, he can build up his loyalty with his +1 while protecting himself before you fire off the -X to get rid of your opponent's library. It really seems like this is one card that can single-handedly mill the opponent out. The problem, though, is he isn't that great at protecting himself, especially if your opponent is even remotely ahead of you, so keeping his loyalty high will be tough. There will just be games where a player draws this in the mid to late game and uses the -X, dumps all 5 loyalty in it, and the game is just over. So it's nice that he has that kind of upside while also having these other 2 abilities, which can help him have different impacts on the game. I think he's a B. Next, it's Malcator's Watcher, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/1 artifact creature Phyrexian drone at common. It's got flying and vigilance, and when it dies, you draw a card. I like cards that replace themselves, and this has a fairly relevant body by virtue of being evasive and an artifact. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Meldweb Curator, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/4 Phyrexian wizard at common. When it enters the battlefield, you put up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. This has a mediocre stat line, and its ability isn't that impressive either. Getting back removal is nice, of course, but putting it on top of your library really isn't that powerful. You'll usually have to wait a whole turn to get it, and if you didn't have something worth getting out of the graveyard in the first place, you're even more out of luck. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Meldweb Strider, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 5/5 artifact vehicle at common. It's got vigilance. It enters the battlefield with an oil counter, and you can remove an oil counter to have it become an artifact creature until end of turn. And it has Crew 3. A 5 mana 5/5 vigilance vehicle with Crew 3 is probably a D. That's just not a good rate for a card that isn't a creature unless you do some extra work by crewing it. The fact this comes with an oil counter does matter, as it does make it so this can become a creature all on its own at least once, and if you can proliferate, it becomes even more of a problem. Of course, the upside there is still that this is just a 5 mana 5/5 with vigilance, which is nice, but there's work to be done to even get it close to the point where it is a 5/5 every turn. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Mercurial Spelldancer, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Phyrexian rogue at rare. It can't be blocked. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you can remove 2 oil counters. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, you copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. A 2 mana 2/1 that's unblockable is already something you just always play, so the fact that this can get oil counters and convert them into copies of spells is pretty nice. You can play this in any blue deck and feel pretty good about it, but if you really got there on instants and sorceries, this is going to be even better. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Mesmerizing Dose, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you tap enchanted creature, then proliferate. Enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. This looks really good to me. 3 mana to lock a creature down is usually a playable card. It doesn't fully remove a creature, and that can be a liability sometimes, and there are lots of ways your opponent can get around this card, like by bouncing their creature. So that card usually isn't premium removal, it's more like a C+, but adding Proliferate is pretty serious. The format has lots of counters to proliferate with, namely poison and oil counters, and the oil counters can significantly upgrade your board, so you'll frequently be able to get some good value out of proliferating, and I feel like that does just enough to make this feel like premium removal. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Mind Splice Apparatus, which for 3 generic and a blue is a rare artifact with flash. At the beginning of your upkeep, you put an oil counter on it. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus. In your typical limited format, a card that does nothing but give you a discount is almost never playable. Outcarding someone matters more than mana for the most part, and this makes you go down a card for a slow-building discount that only matters on 2 card types. It also doesn't add to the board in any meaningful way on its own. Even with the spell deck and oil counters and proliferate in the format, I feel like this is just an F. Next, it's Minor Misstep, which is 1 blue mana for an uncommon instant, counter target spell with mana value 1 or less. This is a cool callback to Mental Misstep and probably has some legs in Modern, but in Limited, this just doesn't counter enough things. It's an F. Next, it's Prologue to Phyrexia, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. Each opponent gets a poison counter, draw a card. This isn't especially powerful on its own, as a poison counter isn't worth a ton, but this is a spell that replaces itself, and the blue-red deck will make decent use of it. Obviously, it works okay in poison decks too, giving it a C-. Next, it's Quicksilver Fisher, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 4/3 Phyrexian Drake at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and then discard a card. This has reasonable flying stats and a solid into the battlefield ability. Looting always tends to play pretty well when it's tacked onto a solid creature, giving this a C+. Next, it's Reject Imperfection, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant. It says counter target spell. If that spell's mana value was 3 or less, proliferate. Cancel ends up being a dud more often than not. The double blue is surprisingly difficult to get at the right time, and leaving up 3 mana to counter something can horribly backfire if your opponent can play around it. Cancel is usually a D+. This has Proliferate upside, which is enough for me to at least consider it in the early going of the format, so I'm giving it a C-. It's nice that it triggers when you counter something cheap, as countering something that costs less than 3 can feel particularly bad with this kind of card. So if your opponent does manage to play around it a little bit, you at least get a consolation prize. Next, it's Serum Snare, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If that permanent had mana value 3 or less, proliferate. This sort of bounce effect is usually okay. It's not ever amazing because it is card disadvantage, but in a lot of decks the tempo can be big, and there are times where you can use it to trade 1 for 1 and get tempo at the same time, like in response to a combat trick. The proliferate upside is nice too, as bouncing something expensive is usually what you want to do with this. But if you have enough counters around, or for some other reason you need to bounce something cheap, you at least get a little upside. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Tamiyo's Immobilizer, which costs 3 generic and a blue for an uncommon artifact. It enters with 4 oil counters on it, and you can tap it and remove an oil counter from it to tap target artifact or creature. This is trying to do an impression of Icy Manipulator, and I think it's doing a pretty solid job. It isn't colorless, which is a bummer, but it doesn't cost mana to tap things, and that's kind of big. You can eventually run out of oil counters, but as we've seen, there's plenty of proliferate in blue, not to mention other oil counter payoffs, so this seems pretty good. It's going to feel pretty bad if the game reaches a point where you run out of counters, but tapping something down 4 times is often enough to get you there anyway. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Tamiyo's Logbook, which costs 2 generic and a blue for an uncommon artifact. You pay 5 generic and a blue and tap it to draw a card. It costs 1 less to activate for each other artifact you control. This reminds me a bit of Joda's Codex. It can give you some unbeatable card advantage, but there's some serious work you need to do to get there. You're going to have to get the cost way down on this significantly, or it won't be worth playing. While there are lots of artifacts in the set, I'm skeptical that just any blue deck can turn this into a card worth playing, so I think it needs a build-around grade. In a deck where you can get down to 1 or 2 mana consistently, it'll probably be a B-, but in your typical blue deck, it's probably a D. Next up, it's Tekuthal Inquiry Dominus, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/5 legendary Phyrexian horror at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. If you would proliferate, you proliferate twice instead, and you can pay 1 generic and 2 blue Phyrexian mana, and remove 3 counters from among other artifacts, creatures, and planeswalkers you control to put an indestructible counter on Tekuthal. This has good stats. Doubling Proliferate is pretty sweet, and the ability to become indestructible is fairly accessible if you're doubling your proliferation. It does take a little bit of work for this to be at its best, and I think that makes it fall a little short of being a bomb. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Thrumming Bird, which costs 1 generic and a blue for a 1/1 Phyrexian Bird Horror at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. This was a nice card last time we saw it, and it will be here too. Multiplying poison and oil is going to be something blue decks want to do. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Transplant Theorist, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/4 artifact creature Phyrexian Artificer at uncommon. Whenever it or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. You can also pay 2 to put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. I'm already considering playing a 4 mana 2/4 that loots when it enters the battlefield, so the additional artifact upside here is nice. The last ability doesn't come up a ton, but sometimes if a game goes crazy long, being able to put cards on the bottom of your library is a big deal. Not only can it allow you to outlast your opponent, but if you're really out of cards, you can basically decide what you draw every single turn. Still, about 99% of the card's value comes from everything else about it and not that graveyard ability. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Trawler Drake, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon Phyrexian Drake. It's a 0/0. It's got flying, it enters the battlefield with an oil counter, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on Trawler Drake. A 3-mana 1/1 flyer is pretty bad. But there are enough ways to grow this between casting spells and proliferating. If you cast a spell that has proliferate, it's suddenly going to be a 3/3, and that certainly isn't far-fetched. It won't be that hard to make it a good investment, and it can keep growing throughout the game. The big downside is that it does die to pretty much everything the turn it comes down. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Unctis, Grand Metatect, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 2/4 legendary artifact creature, Phyrexian Vidalcan at rare. Other blue creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. Other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. And you can pay a blue Phyrexian mana, and until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a blue artifact in addition to its other colors and types, activate only as a sorcery. I guess this is what a completed Grand Architect looks like, and it looks like a pretty darn good card. Just looting when your blue creatures get tapped is a nice ability to have, but also buffing lots of artifact creatures and having the ability to turn creatures into blue artifact creatures makes all of that a lot better, because it lets you turn on all of those bonuses on all of your creatures if you want to, provided you have enough life and mana. The one downside, I guess, is that the loot isn't optional, so you might have to be a little careful sometimes, but that's really splitting hairs. This is going to come down and make your whole board a lot better with regularity. It'll especially thrive in a blue-white deck that is really into artifacts and has access to the might tokens. I think this gets pretty close to just being a straight-up bomb, but I think it does require enough effort to really get going that it's probably just a B+. Next up, it's Unctis' Retrofitter, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 Phyrexian Artificer at uncommon. It's got Toxic 1, and when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/4 for as long as Unctis' Retrofitter remains on the battlefield. This is a good uncommon. A 3-mana 2/3 with Toxic 1 is already something I would consider playing, so the fact that this can turn an artifact into a 4/4 is awesome. You can animate a non-creature artifact or upgrade an artifact creature that is smaller than a 4/4. There are plenty of targets in the set, including things like might tokens, so this is often going to give you a big advantage for only 3 mana. I'm giving this a B. Next, it's Vivisurgeon's Insight, which costs 3 generic and 2 blue for a common sorcery. You draw 3 cards and you proliferate. I have a hard time believing paying 5 for a sorcery that draws you 3 and proliferates is going to be worth it. I love card advantage, of course, but paying that much and likely having only a minimal impact on the board seems like a really bad idea. If your opponent's just curving out and this is what you do with your turn 5, you're probably dead. If you can really stabilize, make the game go long, and then cast this, it's going to feel amazing, but I have a hard time believing things in this format are going to go that way. I'm giving it a D+. And our last blue card is Watchful Blister Zoa, which costs 4 generic and 2 blue for a 4/4 Phyrexian Jellyfish at uncommon. It's got flying. It enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it, and when it dies, you draw cards equal to the number of oil counters on it. So this is a 6-mana 4/4 flyer that draws you a card when it dies. That is a 2-for-1. Sometimes you'll get more oil on it and draw more cards too. This is a pretty bad stat line these days, and it does die to a whole lot of things that cost a heck of a lot less than 6 mana, but I think getting the 2-for-1 offsets that enough that this seems like a fine card to have at the top of your curve, giving it a C+. So those are my thoughts on all the blue cards, and Phyrexia all will be 1. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about all the black cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by buying Nitsahone merch, by becoming a patron, or by becoming a channel member. If you look in the description, you can find ways to do all of those things. Thanks for watching.